Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
You've been with us many times for Faraday courses and other events, and good to see John back here in Cambridge to speak to us today. John, of course, was previously the Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford, and then about a year ago retired and had a wonderful conference last year to mark his retirement in Lancaster University, but I believe is barely more retired than he was before, really, when it comes to speaking and writing and so on, and I know is still a very busy person, so it's a special privilege to welcome him today. He's, as you know, been president of a number of different societies during his career, including the British Society for the History of Science. He's also gave the Gifford Lectures back in the 1990s together with Geoffrey Cantor, who was another speaker here in the Faraday Seminar series earlier on. And his books have been hugely influential in the whole history of science and religion area. So we're very pleased that he's going to speak to us today on should the word nature be eliminated, a historical survey. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dennis. My question today, as you will have inferred, is what is this thing called nature? And secondly, might we not be better off without the word? In one of the most potent images to accompany the new experimental philosophy of the 17th century, Francis Bacon envisioned nature on the rack, forced to reveal her secrets. And the degree to which he personified nature and the many possible ramifications of that gendered language have gendered a lively debate which continues today. And it reminds us, I think, immediately of the high degree of metaphor in popular explication of what the word nature might mean. The problem with the word, I think, becomes obvious as soon as you start reflecting on its simplest meanings. You don't have to be a historian of science to recognize its multiplicity of uses. Might describe a landscape and the components of what that landscape might contain. The word nature might also describe objects to be found in plant and animal kingdoms, as represented, for example, in still life paintings, nature morte, as the French would say. Nature, as depicted in art and poetry, might have the connotations of violence and terror, or of beauty and sublimity, as it did for Wordsworth. So we're brought face to face with ambiguity, because it also then becomes natural to ask how the nature of nature is understood. It might be understood as that which is untouched by human hands, when a contrast between nature and art might be presupposed. And the word can also carry connotations of a veiled or hidden reality, as in nature's secrets. And a world which, of course, is sometimes given access by scientific instruments, thereby raising the difficult philosophical question whether the instrument merely reveals or actually produces an otherwise hidden entity. Nature might also mean that which is real and inviolable, that which puts constraints on human ambition, that which itself is bounded by laws of nature. In what Robert Boyle once described as a vulgar notion, nature really was nature with a capital N, capitalized because the implication was that nature was not merely a world out there, but an agency personified as in Mother Nature. And this journalistic usage continues unabated today, even if in the interests of political correctness, the maternal reference has been deleted. We read in our newspapers that 2005 was the year in which Nature, with a capital N, turned against humankind. This was the tsunami and all those other natural catastrophes of that year. Others have personified the word nature more kindly, as when Freeman Dyson deemed nature to have been kinder to us than we had any right to expect. He wrote in a much quoted passage, as we identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked together to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must, in some sense, have known that we were coming. For a historian of science, the word nature is even more beguiling, because questions about the constitution and interpretation of nature have been central to the scientific enterprise. Not only that, but changes in paradigm have meant that our understanding of the supposed realities beneath the surfaces of nature has itself changed enormously. The title of Carolyn Merchant's well-known book, The Death of Nature, captured many years ago now one such switch from an animated to a mechanistic world picture in 17th century Europe. Underlying that change was one of the portentous new visions identified by Hans Jonas, one in which the new mechanics and astronomy would lead Pascal to articulate his unease, confined to a mere corner of an alienating universe. But no sooner was the real world redefined in terms of the primary qualities of matter, epitomized by the swirling water seas of Descartes' cosmology, than the mechanistic picture was itself displaced, certainly highly qualified by Newton's introduction of invisible forces and active principles. However we interpret the later mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, a scientific understanding of nature was to be transformed again in the 20th century by the new physics of Planck, Einstein, Bohr, and Heisenberg. For the science historian, there's the additional complication that nature is apprehended through idealization, through comparison of the real with the idealized mathematical picture, the model. A process that has been described famously by Alexandre Poiré as explaining the real by the impossible. As the Oxford mathematician Roger Penrose has noted, the continued success of the mathematization of nature forces us to ask whether, in the last analysis, the very concept of nature can be extricated from Platonist metaphysics. Now, for those of us interested in the interpenetration of scientific and religious beliefs, the problems become deeper still. In explaining to undergraduates what is meant by natural theology, one usually has to say something like this. It's the attempt to achieve knowledge of the nature of God through reflection on the natural world using only the natural faculty of reason. So to all the ambiguities associated with natural world, we see here the smuggling of two more senses of nature. The first is that of character or defining essence. In the example here, it's applied to God, but it's applicable more generally to the objects of nature, as in Aristotelian philosophy, where it is in the nature of an earthy body that it will return to its natural place at the center of the cosmos. And the second additional sense of nature there, when speaking of natural theology, pertains to a human attribute, the faculty of reason, which under the doctrine that humans are made in the image of God, differentiated humans from all other creatures, which was also an aspect of an inherent human nature. I want to introduce Robert Boyle again at this point, because that's to record his plea for the abolition of the word nature. In a free inquiry into the vulgarly received notion of nature of 1686, we find Boyle's radical claim that the word nature is so ambiguous that it has become a liability. And I think I've said enough already to indicate that you can make at least a plausible case for that position. Boyle's prescription was to replace it for each of its meanings with a precise description of what was intended by its use. As I summarise Boyle's position just in the next few sentences, it is rather compressed and rather difficult, not least because of his own prolix use of English. So I have printed out on the handout what I'm about to say, because I think it might make it a little easier to follow. Instead of nature in the sense of an active creative agency, natura naturans, Boyle says the word God should be used in order to highlight the difference between the creator and the created order. Proper and profound reverence requires this, he says. Instead of nature in the sense of a defining characteristic, the word essence will do. Where the word denotes that which belongs to a living creature at its nativity, or accrues to it by its birth, why not say that the creature is born so, or has been generated such? Instead of nature in the Aristotelian sense of an internal principle of local motion, all we need say is that the body seems to move spontaneously upwards or downwards. Where nature is used to refer to an established order or course of things corporeal, it's easy, says Boyle, to substitute what it denotes, namely the established order or settled course of things. So we're making some progress here in abolishing the word nature. Where it's used to mean an aggregate of the powers belonging to a body, especially a living one, Boyle recommends this, that we may employ the constitution, temperament, or the mechanism, or the complex of the essential properties or qualities, and sometimes the condition, the structure, or the texture of that body. Well, we might begin to see here why Boyle's radicalism in seeking to exterminate the word might run into difficulty. But he presses on regardless. When nature was used to refer to the world or the entire universe, it's no hardship to substitute those words instead. Accordingly, the phenomena of nature would simply become the phenomena of the world or of the universe. And then for his theological coup de grace, Boyle shot down an eighth usage of the word nature altogether. And he writes, as for nature taken to mean a goddess or a kind of semi-deity, the best way is not to employ it in that sense at all. Boyle's determination to dispense with a troublesome word may not have fallen on deaf ears, but I think we would have to acknowledge that his project was scarcely successful. It does, however, raise questions concerning the forces that have kept the word nature alive, including the topical question whether now, at last, it might be rendered obsolete. So my suggestion today is that along with the need to have a word for that world out there other than ourselves, concepts of nature have been sustained by a series of polarities in which they have featured. This isn't a terribly profound observation, but I think it is worth working out. The first such duality that would spring to mind, perhaps in the context of the Faraday Institute, is the nature-supernature duality. The contrast between two books, those of nature and of scripture, would be another. The ancient contrast between nature and art would be a third. The common dichotomy between nature and nurture would have to be included, as would those features of human experience that underline the impotence of humankind when set against the potency of natural disasters. I was in the Tate in London on Sunday and looked again at Turner's wonderful paintings of the St. Gothard Pass, where you see the reinforcement of that particular dichotomy, where the bridges that humans have constructed just seem so fragile when set against the awesome mountainous blocks of rock that threaten the pilgrim's passage along that pass. If it's correct to say that the vitality of the word nature has depended on the sustenance of such dualities, and not least of the Baconian dichotomy between nature and man, it would follow, I think, that their collapse might create opportunities for new visions, not so much of nature as of its dispensability. So in the remainder of this talk, what I want to propose is that the dualities have indeed been corroded, if not destroyed, with the consequence that the concept of nature has become even more destabilized. So with that thesis we come right into the present. And despite these transformations, I shall also suggest a few reasons, and you doubtless have others, why the term remains remarkably resilient despite the collapse of those dualities. So let's just spend a few moments first of all on the nature-supernature duality. Some theologians, looking back to the Hebrew scriptures, have said that a nature-supernature dichotomy was to be easily misconceived in the Christian tradition. And this is because there is no concept of an independent nature in the Bible, and because on a sophisticated understanding of the doctrine of creation, what we describe as nature is not an autonomous domain, but continually dependent on and sustained by a transcendent power. So on this understanding, divine activity does not consist in supernatural intervention, but in working through the physical powers built into the world. My understanding is that among the early church fathers, Basil saw no contradiction in conceptualizing divine action in this manner, as God worked, and I quote, in, with, and through nature. The problem, of course, is the moment one refers to physical powers as natural causes, one has presupposed the very duality that we might, on theological grounds, wish to judge misconceived. It's quite clear, however, that in early modern European societies, the world was seen as open to marvels and miraculous events that were frequently interpreted as belonging to a supernatural, even in the context of magical effects, a demonic realm. It seems to me that the relationship between the new sciences of the 17th century and popular understandings of the supernatural was very complex. One reason for this is that there was a third category of event, the preternatural, in addition to the natural and the supernatural. The preternatural were unusual, marvelous phenomena which didn't, however, require any suspension of God's ordinary providence for their manifestation. The problem is that the boundaries of the three realms, the natural, the supernatural, the preternatural, despite their metaphysical clarity, were extremely difficult to elucidate in practice. Where the mechanization of nature was favored by Catholic scholars, it could be in the defense of the miraculous not in the defense of its deletion. As in the reasoning of Marin Mersenne, a contemporary of Descartes, one could only differentiate sharply between a marvel and a genuine miraculous event if one already knew the boundaries of the natural. A mechanistic conception of nature could help sharpen those boundaries. More rigorous criteria for the detection of the miraculous had been necessitated by discomforting Protestant critiques of Catholic credulity. Well, there's complexity again in that voluntarist theologies of nature, which stress the freedom of God to make whatever world God wished, and a freedom to act subsequently in ways that made a difference, could themselves blur distinctions between nature and supernature. When Samuel Clarke declared that the laws of nature simply express the way in which God normally chooses to act in the world, Clarke was both eliding the nature-supernature distinction and reserving, as Newton did too, the possibility of abnormal action by fiat. Clarke's contention, as paraphrased by an unconvinced Leibniz, was that there is no difference with respect to God between natural and supernatural. No difference with respect to God between natural and supernatural. With respect to the world, however, the move towards modernity was surely one in which the laws of nature did acquire a greater autonomy and inviolability, until Charles Darwin could say in his autobiography that the more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become. So on this view, nature, in Boyle's sense of a system, swallows up supernature and becomes all there is. And there are many secular historiographies which depict that process in the history of Western culture. But precisely because of that, and I suppose this is a bit of an irony, the word nature retains its resilience, since nature as an entirety, as well as an entity, has traditionally been one of its meanings. Ancient references to the book of nature perhaps remind us of that. And that takes me to my second vulnerable duality. That's the contrast between the book of nature and the book of scripture. So a few reflections on the duality of the two books, which has been a very important metaphor in the history of Christian apologetics. As long as one could speak of two books, the book of God's word and the book of God's works, the use of the word nature might be relatively trouble-free. It was possible for Galileo to argue that God was no less excellently revealed in nature than in the books of the sacred scribes. You see the duality very clearly set out there. But that was already to tip the balance away from an earlier theology in which the scope of natural theology was more tightly circumscribed. Indeed, some scholars have seen an intrinsic instability in the two-book metaphor, in that the image could be used to challenge the Augustinian precept that Scripture is the definitive source of revelation. It was perhaps not until the 19th century that the two books analogy collapsed, a consequence, as James Moore has observed, of ever more stringent professional standards, both in the sciences and in the academic study of theology. Can we say, with that collapse, that the meaning of nature became less secure and even expendable? If the book of nature was eventually buried, another reason was the impropriety of comparing an evolving universe with a fixed and finished product. Books tend to be finished works, perhaps not on the internet. And yet nature was not buried with the book. A movement for nature study in schools, gathering momentum during the 1890s in the USA, would perhaps be one indication of its vitality. The earlier rise of naturalistic theories of evolution, and Darwin's in particular, also gave nature a new lease of life. And I say the Darwinian case in particular because of Darwin's personification of natural selection. Nature became a selector, an agent fulfilling roles formerly ascribed to a divine craftsman. That was Boyle's sense of nature, in which he complained it had usurped the correct word, God. In Darwin's theory, of course, it did so with a vengeance, as the universe of the natural theologians was stolen from them. I'm not saying, incidentally, that I entirely subscribe to this very streamlined view of history, but I think it does actually indicate where some of the problems lie. So thirdly now, my third duality, nature and art. This is the antithesis, which is an ancient one, finding expression in the belief that human artifacts could never reproduce exactly the workings of nature. And many were the debates in medieval alchemy concerning the status of artificial products. Did not true gold have an intrinsic form that the alchemist could never replicate? It was in the context of alchemy that the attempt to imitate nature gained a high profile. The hope was that the human agent, having mastered the right techniques, might speed up natural processes, such as those responsible for the production of metals beneath the Earth's surface. The dream of surpassing nature through art was especially vivid and recurrent as recipes for creating life and achieving immortality were devised. And they are, of course, still being devised today. Although the pretensions of the Magus could easily give rise to religious suspicion, the dream of power over nature did become more respectable during the 17th century. Actually, there's a very interesting recent book by Stephen Roger called The Emergence of a Scientific Culture, which looks at this particular issue very closely, how the dream of power over nature became more respectable during the 17th century. And he actually identifies certain Christian values as crucial to that process. But my point here is that a rigid distinction between nature and art was being compromised during the 17th century, and indeed had already been so by earlier modern chambers of wonders, as they've been called, in which artisans would force nature into collaboration by shaping suggestive natural forms such as crystals, seashells, and certain stones into artifacts. The distinction between nature and art was then more deeply threatened by the mechanistic models characteristic of 17th century mechanical philosophies, because these had the effect of turning nature itself into a form of art. One of the mechanists, Henry Power, spoke of nature as full of narrow engines in which there is much curious mathematics. The architecture of these little fabrics, as he describes them, more neatly set forth the wisdom of their maker. So notice here the existence of a natural theology, But it deserves notice because in Power's account of the mechanical philosophy, causes are to be deduced by reconstructing nature. Ultimately, all things are artificial for Power, because nature itself is nothing else but the art of God. In his book Toward a Theology of Nature, Wolfhard Pannenberg has argued that one of the reasons for the vitality of the term nature has been its attraction for scientists wishing to dispense with the term creation. I think that's an interesting argument. Taking a broad view, there may well be truth in that. It would certainly help to explain why the concept of nature has been seen as a problem for theology. The French evolutionist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck spoke of living things not as creatures, but as products of nature. Nevertheless, as Power and other physico-theologians of the 17th and 18th centuries show, theology itself, insofar as it embraced arguments for design, actually made its own contribution to the blurring of the nature-art distinction. It was perhaps willing to do so because through the study of the microscopic world in particular, the perfection of nature's art, or as would have been correctly said, God's art, far transcended human artistry. I think a corollary of this is that it would be possible to write a detailed history of how during the 19th century in particular, great strides were made in simulating natural processes. The artificial synthesis of organic compounds makes an excellent case study, and it's one that's interested me ever since 1968 when I published my first paper in the history of science. An interesting test case because it was in 1828 that Friedrich Wöhler first synthesized urea. And that reproduction of a natural product, exciting though it was, didn't actually replicate the conditions under which nature did the work. The high temperature and concentrated acid employed by Wöhler would have been fatal to the living organism. But I mention this simply as a reminder that there was never a smooth path to the surpassing of nature. But we do now have pharmaceutical products, different kinds of insulin, for example, that can function more quickly and more slowly where necessary than the naturally occurring compound. We have custom-designed genes that do not exist in nature. Computers have surpassed the human brain in memory power. Crucially, programs of genetic enhancement are raising the question whether the concept of a fixed human nature might not be obsolete. With the collapse of the nature-art distinction, are not the days of nature numbered? So it seems to me this interfusion of nature and technology does give rise to new visions, but not so much of nature, but as of an increasingly manipulated nature. I enjoyed a rather trivial example that came to light in a Sunday newspaper about 10 days ago, which was reporting the little skirmish there had been when it turned out that a cobra, which was persuaded to spit at one of our great TV naturalists, and therefore was very usefully captured on camera, that the cobra had been very carefully placed there, having been extracted from a snake farm, so that what might happen, as it were, in nature could be transmitted to the rest of the world. And this had caused the obvious schmozzle because of the possible suppose, almost an ethical issue about whether you should give the illusion that Attenborough had just chanced upon the snake. And the phrase that caught my eye was the artifice of natural history filming. Just in that one phrase, the artifice and the natural collapse into something quite different. Now, this raises a further question which I've seen discussed in the literature. Would it be far-fetched to imagine a day when down on the farm cows choose when to be milked, when to make their own way to the stalls, where they are identified by a chip, receive an automatic rub-down, listen to classical music as a laser-guided machine attaches to their udder, and receive a head massage, all while the farmer takes a vacation, keeping in contact with his herd via a laptop. Well, it's not so far-fetched because it's already happened, apparently, with concomitant claims for the improvement of nature. And notice nature creeping in again, but the improvement of nature, in that the cows, having learnt how to relieve themselves through this system, are allegedly, and I quote, a lot less stressed and more content. Now, this vignette, it seems to me, could stand for many in at least 3 respects. Since it was through artifice that cows were originally bred for larger udders, the notion that a cow without a chip belongs to a pristine nature would itself be simplistic. Secondly, there could be, and has been, theological debate about the propriety of intervening in natural processes. And I'm not thinking here of religious gut reactions that complain of playing God, but more sophisticated reflection on what it might mean to collaborate with deity in the improvement of the world. For the 19th century Scottish evangelical, Hugh Miller, the rendering of cows more useful to humans was a manifestation of an apposite spirituality in which God-given natural resources were malleable and legitimately moulded. Thirdly, just going back to that same vignette, the innovative techno-nature might give cows more control over their lives, but it leaves ethical problems still unresolved. Despite reassurances about the benefits of the robotic system, the prospect of expanding it into yet another branch of factory farming would seem to be an obvious cause for concern. It is, however, with reference to human rather than bovine learning, that claims for the annihilation of the nature-art distinction become, I think, even more pressing. Analogies between human learning as a process of neurochemical self-organization and mathematical models of artificial intelligence in self-organizing computer systems have given rise to claims such as the following. This is a rather convoluted claim, and so I've also printed this out on the handout. I'm quoting from a recent commentator. Regardless of whether they occur within a software system or a human brain, material modification and learning become continuous processes. After this, it can either be said that natural human intelligence is artificial and constructed in the sense that its apparatus mutates as it learns, grows, and explores its own potentiality, or that artificial intelligence is natural, insofar as it pursues the processes at work in the brain and effectively learns as it grows. Either way, this is the bottom line, either way the distinction between nature and artifice is collapsed. Well, if this were truly the case, a new vocabulary to describe our prophetic visions would seem essential. On one reading, our capacity to manipulate and our ability to have visions at all. are products of evolution, with the implication that what we're discussing is, in the last analysis, simply nature transforming itself. But in the more radical, less preemptive meanings of nature, the vision of limitless self-modification spells the end not only of the words human nature, but of the supposed reality to which they have routinely referred. A few words now on the nature-nurture duality. The hypothesis that a fourth polarity between nature and nurture has helped to keep nature in the frame could, I think, be explored in as great a depth as a history of the nature-art duality. I certainly don't intend to do that here. Its social and political dimensions have been enormous, as reference to the single word eugenics would remind us. Many past investigations and debates appear to have centred on a simple either-or. Is this behaviour a result of nature or of nurture? But to weigh the respective contribution of each is at once a more challenging programme. As a recent study by Matt Ridley has shown, the antithesis between the two poles is itself misconceived. Matt Ridley's his text, I think, if I remember rightly, is just called Nature versus Nurture, or something of that kind. And it's the interplay between nature and nurture that counts and makes us who we are. It seems less clear, however, than in the case of the nature-art duality, that a syncretic nature-nurture approach would necessarily compromise the category of nature itself. And in fact, Ridley chose to end his book with the lines, "Nature versus nurture is dead. Long live nature via nurture." And one can't miss the irony in his speculation that the very recourse to dichotomies, the very recourse to the kind of dualities I've been exploring here, is in our genes, is in human nature. So however many dualities and dichotomies I explore as a historian, ultimately, on his view, it's in my own genes, and for that I apologize. The longevity of nature in the context of a nature-nurture antithesis may derive from the constraints we both ascribe to and discover in the materials of scientific inquiry. And I say this because the dictum that we are what our genes make us would be an obvious example of how such constraints find expression in popular parlance. It's hard to overestimate the consequences of a paradigm dominated by a kind of health-based rhetoric in which specific genes are deemed responsible for specific maladies. The day on which I first wrote that last sentence saw the announcement of the discovery of a gene that correlates with a high risk of schizophrenia. It was already known that children missing a certain part of chromosome 22 were at risk, but it was now reported that having a particular version of the gene COMT worsens the symptoms. And it just struck me, reading the report on that discovery, that as long as the public is confronted only with a gene-based causality, it will be very hard to dispense with that meaning of nature that refers to those material realities that set bounds to the possible. This particular sense of nature is evident in statements to the effect that to pursue a particular life choice might be, and I quote, to defy nature. An editorial in the British Medical Journal for 16 September 2005 asserted that women delaying pregnancy until the age of 35 or over are, and I quote, defying nature and risking heartbreak. Above that age, fertility rates plummet. Well, since that article, of course, we've had women in their 60s still producing offspring. Nature might be malleable and open to remedial technology, but underlying material realities cannot be disregarded. And the question then, I think, becomes whether we might prefer a word other than nature to describe the properties and disposition of material objects, their capacities, for example. I'm coming towards the end, but I've not so far considered what some might see as the greatest challenge to an uncritical use of the word nature. This is the complicating fact that in our attempts to understand the material realities, spiritual too for that matter, underlying our concepts of the natural, those very concepts are theory-laden and in important respects constructed rather than simply read off the face of nature. The challenge to which many historians of science have ably responded has been expressed in this way. However natural categories are, we need to search whether and by what means they find their existence as natural categories. For feminist writers, for example, the most telling illustrations come from the manner in which a predominantly male medical profession has categorized women gynecologically. Both the naturalizing of women and the feminizing of nature have had their correlates in male domination. It's been pointed out very recently in Nature. Interesting that the leading... I guess I'd spotted that before. That an explanation for the relatively few women involved at the highest level in the sciences that appeals to their innate inadequacies seems to have a peculiar appeal to men. But when I read such explanations, I'm always reminded of that nice little aphorism of, was it Henry Kissinger, who said, "Nobody will ever win the battle of the sexes. There's just too much fraternizing with the enemy." What I've been suggesting is that to ask whether there can be new visions of nature is to ask an exciting but difficult question. Such are the ambiguities of the word nature that, for a historian of science at least, the possibility of dispensing with the word altogether, as Boyle wished to do long ago, is attractive. I've suggested that the vitality of the word has been sustained by a set of dualities in which it has been lodged, and which in their turn have been qualified, even deconstructed, through our greater understanding. And we could extend the analysis further to incorporate the natural-unnatural duality, which of course has featured prominently in ethical discourse. For are there not many examples where what might once have been deemed unnatural, as with homosexual congress, for example, has had to be recategorized, not by everybody, of course, but certainly by many. Notice, though, that in each case, some sense of a constraining reality, a reified nature, still seems to survive. And this is where it seems to me, in locating new visions of nature, it is very difficult to expunge the word altogether. A certain givenness of nature, understood as an available resource, is assumed even in describing it as malleable. Yet, having raised this question, whether visions of nature should be not of nature but of its dispensability, I would like to conclude with a very simple observation, that in the most radical visions of a future society, the overarching duality no longer seems to be that of man and nature, but of meta-man, and a reality that combines in intimate union what was once nature with technological magic, I suppose we could say. because we are moulded by our machines as we mould them. And the future that continues to emerge from that symbiosis is in a non-trivial sense, not for us as we are now. With reference to a host of post-human visionaries, one recent scholar, Langdon Winner, has cautioned against the current frenzy surrounding cyborgs, hybrids, transhumans, extraterrestrians, and the like. There is, he insists, still a place for rethinking what it means to be human in the first place. And I must say I have a lot of sympathy for that, because in so much of the fancy technological literature, it seems to be assumed that what it means to be human is somehow determined and belongs to a past. And yet from a theological position, it seems to me there's still a lot of work to be done. This is a place where I think theologians as well as scientists will feel that they have a right of access. Even in Winner's critique, however, there is a loser, if you'll forgive the pun, and it's the word nature. The relevant category, he says, is less that of human nature than that of the human condition. With an essential human nature in peril, there can still be the vision of a shared human condition, which, as he insists, is more likely to provide a sound anchor for ethical conduct and wise global policies, and intoxicating divisions between humans and post-humans that some of my Oxford colleagues were exploring with great excitement. So, final conclusion. The issues I've been raising here, the protean meanings of nature, the status of the dualities by which it's been sustained, the desirability and possibility of its abolition, the sense of ineradicable constraint that lends plausibility to the substitute of the word realities for nature, have, of course, been discussed many times before, and often with impressive sophistication. Lorraine Daston and Fernando Vidal have concluded an editorial contribution to their recent book, The Moral Authority of Nature, by considering the resistance of the word nature to critical annihilation. I'd just like to end with their perspective, because it complements the arguments that I've suggested here. Their salutary conclusion is that no amount of well-intentioned intellectual political hygiene is likely to get rid of the word. Their primary reasons are these. The word nature survives because of the investment placed in it by those who boost their own credentials by claiming to speak for it. Doctors, scientists, jurists, theologians, politicians, activists of every hue become the voice of nature in so many contexts. And I think this is a powerful observation, because it reminds us that dialectical philosophical analysis can take us only so far in the attempt to categorize contending constructions of nature. It also, I think, provides a telling reason why to substitute the word reality for nature will probably never work in practice. Because to invoke reality to bolster one's authority and to sustain one's professional, social, or political agenda is just a little too flagrant, making it a little too obvious what the game is. The advantage of nature is that it's a term of mediation, no less absolute in its decree, but more tolerant of the human voices that speak for it. So to seek or to dwell on new visions of nature may, in a crucial respect, and if I'm right, be to privilege the wrong sense. New visions of nature, in the last analysis, will continue to be new voices for nature. Thank you.
so I'm hoping we've got a microphone somewhere. We don't have a microphone. Okay, so just to, when you're speaking of questions, if you can speak them nice and loud, and we'll get the camera right on you so we pick it up. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, in the front.
Thank you very much, very interesting. Secularists and, I suppose, atheistic biologists tend to use biodiversity. I'm never sure what it means, but I suspect it includes also a substitute for nature, or more particularly Mother Nature. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure there's a necessary connection between those two ideas. I think biodiversity would be a facet or an aspect of nature, that there is just a huge range of living things that they would account for in standard evolutionary terms. I think. What is clear is that the atheistic biologist that I think you're thinking of would certainly be very strongly committed to what philosophers call naturalism, which is the view that you only need to look to natural causes to explain the process. But of course what such atheistic accounts often overlook is precisely the point I was referring to in the talk, that in classical Christian theology, that dichotomy between nature and supernature was never presented in the way that modern atheists like to. I mean, they like to present it in such a way that nature annihilates supernature. But that wasn't the way I think the distinction was understood.
Right. I'd like to thank you very much. It's very enlightening. There's another area of nature that you didn't encompass, and that is this new phrase that has been brought in recently, which speaks of nature natural. And it comes particularly, of course, from those who are concerned as activists, anti-genetic engineering. So the question is that if it is produced in nature, then it is seen as being unblemished and unaffected by human intervention, which is totally untrue, of course. And then there's the human unnatural, or the nature unnatural, which is where genetic engineering has been utilized. And I think that that is an area that, both from a Christian perspective and in terms of bioethics, that we have to wrestle with in a very serious way. And I was intrigued by your suggestion that scientists wish to dispense with the term creation, because I'm not sure that that's true at all. For example, in the field of embryo research, it's extremely difficult to get my colleagues to speak of anything other than the fact that they are creating an embryo.
Right. The particular context in which I made that remark was Pannenberg's notion that if you took a history of Western philosophy, you would find that the word nature comes to far greater prominence in the wake of secular scientific paradigms, societies, and whatever. So I don't think he would be saying that the word creation has itself completely gone from scientific discourse. Rather that nature is used as a substitute, if you like, for the creation, where the creation expressed the fact that one would look at that reality outside ourselves as a work of creation. And I guess that even among your colleagues, your secular colleagues, who are happy to talk about the creation of an embryo, they would be less happy to see the world as a whole interpreted as a creation. That would be my hunch. But
Okay, Derek,
a similar point, if I may. Natural is almost regarded as a good, and that I've come across that in looking at novel foods, novel pharmaceuticals, and if they occur naturally, they must, almost by definition, be good for you. And this is used to justify non-pasteurized milk, for example, and other sorts of various sorts of agriculture, but also is part of the whole culture of an anti-science culture almost of healing. And it's again this: the natural is good, and we are the disturbers and destroyers of the natural.
Yes, but I think enough has been said, hasn't, to indicate why that is actually an unsatisfactory.
Well,
phrase.
yes, indeed, but it causes real problems to food regulators who are asked to deal with novel foods in a different way because they're natural, quote unquote. And this actually, this is a governmental problem almost, rather than an ethical problem.
I'm actually reminded of, why this has come to my mind, I'm not quite sure, but in one of the classic texts of physico-theology, I think it was Durham's book, he's trying to cope with the fact that there are imperfections in the natural as far as humans are concerned. Hemlock is not good for Socrates. It's very good for goats, though, and that's how he preserves his natural theology.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Just sort of, as far as I understand it, there's two arguments you're putting forward for dispensing with the word nature. One of them is perhaps to do with the ambiguity of the word, and it seems to me that there's plenty of words that have ambiguous meanings, and we nevertheless retain them because they're useful to us. But there's a second position which I think you're putting forward, as I understand it, which is to do with these dichotomies, which are in many cases collapsing, and therefore we don't need the word nature so much after all. Now, on that second argument, it does seem to me that that is a particular philosophical view that people might disagree with, in fact quite an empirical one. So, for example, it may be important for some people to maintain the distinction between the perceptions that are possible in the human mind and the mechanistic computer activities of a robotic mechanism of some sort. And in order to put that position and maintain that philosophical view, it seems to me that you need the word nature. So you may or may not agree with that position, but the word nature is important in order to have the argument and the discussion. So I think I just wanted to raise that point.
No, I'm very happy with your summary of my position there, and I do entirely see the point you're making. The word does have that peculiar resilience which we find we have recourse to. On the first point, simply the extraordinary ambiguity of it. Boyle mentioned 8 different meanings in his paper, but philosophers and historians of science have, said there are something like 87 different meanings of the word during the Enlightenment alone. So if I'm arguing for greater caution with the use of the word, I think that only reflects something that we've known for a very long time, which is that this, of all words, does tend to be very unclear unless you make it crystal clear what you are intending by it in a particular context.
Okay, well, we do always promise we're going to finish at 2. We've gone over a little bit. We could carry on for another hour, but I'm afraid people have things to do. We have to move on. So let's just thank John again for a great talk. So,